This is Chris Warnock and Andy Kessler, and this is another podcast in the deep astrology, astrology, and astrological magic as a spiritual path. Um, this episode, we're going to talk about a lot of things, but the sort of the major focus of it is nihilism, and that's immediately it sort of makes me think of the Big Lebowski. You remember that scene when he says, with
The nihilists,
the
yeah.
nihilists, at least if it's Nazism. I mean, whatever to say about the tenets of National Socialism, at least it's a philosophy. Um, I think nihilism it's a lot of confusion about it, and but really, I was going to say, why are we talking about this at all? I mean, we're talking about astrology and magic. What I find is that astrology and magic are kind of up here, and we're not. When you launch into it, you're lacking the foundation, and so, and I think that's really what I'd say about the foundation is worldview. And that's, what do you mean by worldview? Worldview is your conscious philosophy, but also your unconscious assumptions about reality. So in a very real sense, it's your reality. And so I think most people just sort of jump in and assume, yeah, we know what reality is. And yet they don't have a very clear idea of even what their view or what their what the reality they're seeing things from is. And the way things work is that if there's different worldviews, and to a very amazing extent, if you change your worldview, then your reality changes. And so, but the main reality or the main worldview rather that people have nowadays in modern society is what I would call atheistic materialism. Atheistic materialism is essentially the view that nothing really exists except matter and energy. And so when we talk about thought, the brain, which is a physical thing, thinks, and that's electrical or chemical impulses. Everything is reducible to matter and energy. And so spiritual is sort of a synonym for psychological, maybe, and psychological is, again, it's all physical. And, I think that's, you can think about it in terms of causality. I mean, the only connection between things is either through energy or matter. And of course, A equals mc squared, matter is equal to energy. Even the terms rational, rational means essentially atheistic materialistic, scientific is the same, is a sort of a similar thing. That really is the basis for how people see reality. And I talk about the truce, that happened about 1700. So previous to 1700, Western society, like every other society in the world, was in every traditional society, included the spiritual, in fact, saw the spiritual as primary. And so about 1700, with the quote, I'll say quote, enlightenment, essentially what you've got is, I guess I call this a truce, where the atheistic materialists get to determine the nature of reality. And then if you want to be religious, you can compartmentalize it. You can kind of be crazy on the weekend. So you can go to church, believe in God, and then come back and be a regular person or a chemist or, just like I said, ordinary person. And, and your actual philosophy doesn't have a real spiritual quality to it. And even modern New Age people, they tend to have an unconscious atheistic materialistic approach and layer the New Age stuff on top of it. For example, astrologers, if you ask a modern astrologer how it works, they'll be talking about string theory or quantum mechanics or synchronicity or something like that. And they really don't have a causal mechanism for how astrology works. And if they do have a causal mechanism, then it's going to be something, energy or matter or something like that. So basically, and I've been jump in, Andy.
Oh, well, let me ask you something, and this is probably tangential, but do you know where the term, kind of the provenance of the term energy? I mean, it's obviously Greek, but like how did the ancients conceptualize it? Like, was energy viewed as kind of an animating principle of matter, or like, I mean, I'm just
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think energy really originally was like kinetic energy.
Kinetic energy, that which
Which
made
is the
things move.
physical, yeah, exactly, moving energy. Or you think about, at the same time, that's very spiritual, because if you talk about Aristotle, like the prime mover,
Right.
right, it's not talking about a material thing. So when we go back, anytime you go from modern thought and you try to look at past, like 1700 is a good, but whatever, you can draw the line arbitrarily in various ways. There's a tremendous distortion of it, because there's a whole classic thing, Giordano Bruno, who, for example, is a martyr to science. It's like,
Right.
no, he was burned at the stake because he had heretical spiritual ideas, and he was a magician. He was an incredible master of, memory techniques. But he was by no means, it can be considered a scientist. So that's just one of those incredible distortions of it, of reality. And like Aristotle, oh, well, he was a philosopher, he was rational, so we'll just kind of squeeze him into being an atheistic materialist, even though he clearly wasn't. So I think, and the energy stuff, it's sort of like Star Trek. I think that's like energy fields. It is kind of physicalized. It's either light, right, or sort of physical thing or whatever. Or even magnetism. I mean, magnetism was considered to be an occult force, a hidden force. And so now, like, oh, we've got it all figured out. It's like, yeah, you got some, you can, do generators, and you can, do that sort of stuff with it and create power and do all sorts of things. But what is it? That's a little bit difficult. I was just thinking about that the other day. It's like, even though we think of matter as being very solid, right? Anything you go in on and you blow it up, like past the atomic level, it disappears. There's nothing there. I mean, it's mostly empty space, and otherwise it's these lines of force, which whatever that is. So it's like, quantum mechanics stuff, like, oh, quantum mechanics. The problem with quantum mechanics is that they still won't get spiritual with it. It's still basically kind of this weird, well, you have to be an expert to understand it, and it's really weird, but it's still not, you're not dealing with angels or personalities or anything like that. It's still kind of bits of stuff, or this, mathematics that nobody can understand. You just kind of have to take it on faith, that this is the reality. But it's interesting if you look at, like I was saying, in the historical process, let's talk about the 1700. It begins in the Middle Ages. Basically, there's this process of essentially discarding the magical and the spiritual, parts of, like, Catholicism. I mean, which is present in a fossilized form to this day. I mean, you can go to Catholic Church and they have mass, and you have the body and blood of Christ. It's, miraculously transformed, the spiritual essence of it. You've got the blessing of the pets. You've got rosaries. You've got angels. You've got saints. All this stuff is still around in the Catholic Church in a sort of, like I said, fossilized form. That sort of gets thrown out in Protestantism. Like, well, we have God, but we're going to toss everything else out. And essentially, Protestantism is sort of a way station on the road to atheistic materialism. So by the time you get rid of throwing all of the other magical and spiritual stuff out, you get to God, and you're like, well, you throw out God too. It really doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. And it seems like nowadays you sort of have a choice between either you have this sort of foolish belief in the white sky god, the bearded guy up in the clouds with the thunderbolts, and if you do something wrong inexplicably, they have these weird rules, and if you break the rules, you get zapped, and it doesn't make any sense, or you're an atheistic materialist, and but a lot of it is, I think, and this is what the problem is, that people are not consciously aware of what their philosophy or worldview is. I mean, there's a few people that are sort of militant atheists, and they get upset because they're like, everybody knows there's no God. Everybody knows there's nothing except matter and energy. Yet you people go around, saying that there isn't. I mean, you have it's total doublethink. It must drive them crazy. But then it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to, I believe in God, but you don't act like it. I mean, otherwise the rest of your life, you're acting like an atheistic materialist.
Right. Excellent. Well said. I think, in our talks prior to this, private talks, we've kind of discussed different varieties of nihilism and stuff. And I think, we decided we really want to address the more pervasive form of nihilism with our contemporaries, with people in the contemporary world. And so how should we maybe begin to say something more about the forms of nihilism?
Well, I was going to say is that the atheistic materialist is sort of the basic view. Like I said, there's nothing except matter and energy, right? And I think a lot of people, if you push, certainly a scientist, if you push them on it, would say that's true. That's the spiritual or psychological is nothing more than just sort of like an add-on to material. They're not really there. It's conceptual, right? It's not really, it's symbolic. It's not really real. Like, this pen is real. It's got physical form. And you can see it, I can see it. Anyone who came in here would be able to see this pen if they weren't blind. Whereas a thought, I mean, that's not really there. Maybe we can see some brain activity or whatever, but we're not really sure if that's thoughts, whatever that is. So nihilism is just sort of another step beyond. It's sort of the next logical step after atheistic materialism.
Hmm.
So, if you look it up on Wikipedia, it's interesting because there's all these different philosophical. You can see that they've been thinking about this a lot. I think that what they call existential nihilism is probably the most prevalent form of nihilism, and that apparently is the view that there's no inherent meaning or value to anything, right? That there's no underlying purpose to the universe, right? There's a lot of the stuff like, you're just one tiny little person in this huge infinite universe. The universe doesn't care about you. Your life has no meaning, and it has no purpose. You can't make any change in the totality of existence. And I think that's probably the most prevalent form of nihilism, is that existential nihilism.
Right. And let me just jump in and say, I'm someone who tends to focus a lot on, I guess, what we could euphemistically call social pathologies of the country, or the cities, and where we live, and how people are today. And to my mind, it's pretty obvious how these things arise from this underlying form of nihilism, and how that is in a sense disseminated or amplified in various ways by the social structures, I guess, to be vague about it, but just that people are kind of caught in this
Well, it's certainly the embedded. I mean, and then the next thing you go to is that if nothing ultimately exists, if nothing is really real, it's like then there's also this view that the only thing that's real is pain and suffering and death. I mean, it's like everything's ripped away from you, and you might be happy for a short time, but you're never going to be unhappy, and death. I mean, you're born and yet you're going to die. It's like, what's the point of life? And that's that whole meaning of life thing. They used to have this sick, we don't have as much now, but like, what is the meaning of life? It's like, because the obvious answer to people is that there is no meaning to life, or that the meaning of life is awful. It's terrible. And I think if you hear this stuff, it's sort of like resonant. I mean, there's a lot of, as the society has become, the spiritual side of things it was decayed anyway. By the time you get to the Victorian era, really start to fall apart, and people step away from that. Then, I think that most people don't necessarily live their life in a nihilistic way. I think that their natural inborn sense isn't that way. But the problem is that the philosophy that's put forward by the elites, academia or the scientists, or just, as you're saying, that there's a lot of this sort of nihilism that's put out there.
culture, industry.
Exactly. Then that it does cause, the loss of meaning. I don't think anything worse than loss of meaning. I mean, it's really hard. It's bad enough to be in pain, but to then think it's meaningless, that's just really causes an incredible amount of suffering.
Right. And I think I've said this to you before, but I think it's worth saying again. People like C.G. Jung would always point to the social, to the spiritual life of a collective as being a container, and then point to what happens when those containers are shattered or burst. And again, there's a quote I came across by William Burroughs when I was younger that I never forgot. I don't remember where he said something like, if you want to destroy a people, destroy their gods. That's what you do first, and then watch them fall apart.
That was pretty classic. I mean, like, for example, the first emperor of China, when he conquered the other states, would take their whole palace and gods and stuff and move it to his capital. And I think the Aztecs would do the same thing. So it's like, that's a pretty classic. And the other thing I would say is that we have non-religious religions now, like communism. Communism is a non-religion religion. I mean, you have to have faith, in the proletariat and the dialectic and all that. And, it's not religion, it's scientific, but nevertheless, you believe in it and you have faith in it and you follow it, blindly or not blindly. Science is often treated the same way, as a sort of a pseudo religion. And
economic life.
I think that, what I would say about it is that, when we think about this type of nihilism, it's doubt, skepticism, pessimism. This is all, very much part of it. And I think, what I see in that is that it's very much a particular kind of perspective, because everybody has had in their life has pain and suffering and the sense of, why is this happening, and wondering about meaning. I mean, most people do. And in particular, what it is an egoic perspective. And the ego self, the I self, and this is getting sort of Buddhist, is, sees itself as the only reality. I mean, that you're the center of the universe. Everything revolves around you. What you want is most important, right? And yet there is a sense of that at some point that you didn't exist. I mean, right? You're before you were born, right? You weren't there, and now you're there, and you're going to die, and you're going to be gone. And so that's I think very much an egoic perspective. And insofar as that's the perspective you're looking from, then that is a very pessimistic perspective. You're not part of anything bigger. I mean, you can say as a symbolically you are, but in reality you're not. You're just this physical body, and when this physical body goes, you're going to be gone too. And that's pretty freaky. And so that's what I would say, is that you can see how it sort of nihilism dovetails with atheistic materialism, right? Because everything's separate, everything's bits of matter. It's all temporary, and there's also stuff going against what you want. I mean, it's very frustrating, to be this individual point, like, for example, today the weather's in the Midwest is really hot. I mean, it's like we're going to have like 90 degrees for the next like 10 days, no rain. It's like, I don't like that. Everything's going to get hot. I don't like it, blah, blah, blah. I can get all pissed off about that. It's interesting too, though, the nihilism is, there's actually this literal belief in nothing, right? I mean, that's the thing, is that you came from nothing, right? That a lot of sort of creation was ex nihilo, right? Creation from nothing.
Right.
Nothing there, and then there was something, and then something lasts a while, and then it goes away. I mean, that's really the egoic perspective of reality. And then I think that's, I certainly have a sort of primal fear of like being like isolated, like just in a dark space, you know what I mean? Like nothingness. There's just sort of awareness, and there's just nothing. It's dark and you're freaked out. I mean, that's sort of one of my primal fears. So I think that feeds into the nihilism as well. So, it also, like I said, you can have nothing as the ultimate the ultimate principle of things, which is a little crazy, because nothing, there's no such thing as nothing. Because once you posit it, it's like, show me nothing, right? It's like empty space. Well, that's space, right? It has a capacity to, space is empty, right? It has the capacity to be full. It's not a nothing, right? There is no nothing. I mean, the word nothing is a something, right? The concept is something, there's no nothing you can point to.
Sure. I just wanted to bring this up. This just struck me now. It doesn't really pertain to what you were just saying, but I mean, there's a kind of way in which, well, for the author H.P. Lovecraft, who was now absolutely one of my favorite writers, but he was absolutely an atheistic, materialistic person, believer in scientism to a large degree. But I think that there's a level at which his worldview could be posited as sort of an antidote to sort of human-centric, egocentric activity, because the view is almost entirely, well, humanity's nothing. So all this bullshit that you guys are running around doing is, you think we're the center, but we're not. Look at the vastness, the chasms of space. We're nothing in comparison. And then there's the poet Robinson Jeffers, who's a great poet, and I wouldn't say he was a nihilistic, but his work was so much about the natural world and life, natural life cycles of death, the violence of nature, and in many ways underscoring how paltry this human-centric view of life is, that it's actually not that way. But that's something different. I just was thinking about that, though.
No, I think that's there's a balance between that, because it's like, it's just funny. I always laugh about I don't say it's scientists or whatever, but there's always this like, oh, we're not like, the animals. We're different from animals. Like animals don't do this. And it's like, well, they don't have cities. Well, what about ants? What about termites? Well, that's not the quite same. And I was watching this, what was it, like a chimpanzee, like doing some tool thing, it was like had it all figured out. And in fact, the other day I saw magic tricks for birds, and they were figuring out the magic tricks and everything like that. I mean, we are apes. We are walking apes, right? I mean, we got rid of all the other there's tree apes still, right? But there's not any more walking apes anymore. We killed them all, and it's funny too, because the scientific name for humans is not just Homo sapiens, which means wise man, but Homo sapiens sapiens, wise man. I'm like, you guys are really trying to prove something there, aren't you? And at the same time, it's like you're the center of the universe, but so is everything.
Right.
It's like you can't take away from your unique perspective and your unique, except that you're not really you in the Buddhist view. I mean, the ego self is a false superimposition onto reality again, in the Buddhist view. So it's like, that's what I would say too, is that nihilism is not wrong. It's like, I can't prove. He's like, can you prove this? I'm like, what I'm doing today is just sort of putting some stuff out there. I think it's useful to think about worldview. And if you have a natural inclination to nihilism, that's your thing. I mean, that's your, if you decide this is your worldview, this is your philosophy, it's like, you can't really say that that's wrong. But the flip side is that to say it's right for everybody, that this is reality, this is how it is.
This is how it is.
It's a worldview, right? That's a worldview. And it's not an unrealistic perspective. I mean, if you see yourself as limited to the body, if you see yourself as a limited being in space and time, you're going to have all these problems. You're going to have despair, hopeless, meaninglessness. These are all natural to that particular perspective. But the fact is, it is possible to have other perspectives. And, it's interesting because, we were talking earlier, it's like, I like to take a walk. There's a cemetery that's right near my house that's maintained by the city. Very beautiful. And today I was walking early in the morning, and the sun was shining, and it shines through these beautiful trees that are along a path. So the sun is really beautiful in the trees, and then there's beautiful shadows on the ground. The breeze was blowing, the birds were singing, and I was like, this is just really amazing. Now, it's not going to last. I mean, it's probably going to be hot and everything's going to dry out. It's going to turn to winter. The trees will get knocked down eventually. I'll die. But for that moment, there, that was really quite beautiful. And it was it really was an uplifting moment. And so, there is a tremendous amount of joy and beauty and happiness and fulfillment present in reality. I mean, there are people that have terrible lives. I mean, you could end up being, horrible things happening to you. So it's not to say that you don't want to be a Pollyanna about it, because there's all sorts of terrible stuff that's happening. But there's also, to only focus on the negative and only focus on the meaninglessness is to miss out on the patterning and the underlying, there's incredible patterning, incredible meaning in life. And it's just weird to me, the idea that you create your own meaning. I'm like, I don't know about that. I mean, it seems to me that it's like, the things that I've found meaningful a lot of times have been manifesting greater forces. Like, for example, as an attorney, it's like to be a vessel of justice, or be a vessel of mercy, or to be someone who's able to help people resolve their disputes, or to make law. I mean, these are all, I really feel like it's manifested through me. The ego stuff is less, the law in particular, for example, is this very long tradition, and I have a role that I play, right? And that's an important role, but nevertheless, it's hard to say that I created it. I'm just sort of doing my dharma, I'm fulfilling my duty within that structure. And that's, to me, very joyful and very meaningful.
Yeah. And I would definitely posit that as, well, obviously it's a wonderful thing to, but I would, on the other end of that would be, as we were kind of discussing earlier, the nihilism and the behaviors that arise from, something simple like that everything's ephemeral, that nothing lasts, everything dies, everything will end. There's that. And then related to that, the desire and the fact that is it, not human nature to pursue desire and then one after the other, and nothing can be ultimately satisfying, right? And it's continually having these kinds of experiences where we imagine something is fulfilling or in some way, and we're drawn to it and we pursue this, and then maybe you attain it, you get it, and you have this experience, and then, okay, now what's next? On to the next thing, on to the next, on to the next. I mean, this is an ancient wisdom. I'm making this up, but but the fact that it's like it can never end, and nothing can ultimately kind of quench the thirst. And I think a lot of the fucked up shit we see arise, these things have been arising from this kind of confusion and madness, right? That relates to, that pertains to those things, that
It's just sort of natural though. It's sort of like I think that it's, what was I going to, I had a couple different thoughts about what you were saying. First of all, again, from a particular perspective, right? You're saying what what would be fulfilling? It's like, what if you just accepted everything? If you had total acceptance, then you would be fulfilled, right? Because everything that happens in every moment, you're like, okay. I mean, this is a really kind of like, then there is no frustration. Then there's pain, but there's not, the suffering isn't added on top of it. There's no resistance to what happens. And it's like, part of the thing, there's a tendency with a spiritual view is like, for example, nirvana. Okay, if I do this right, if I go through the steps and I do this stuff properly, then I'll just be happy all the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, probably not. I mean, it's like, again, it's hard for me to say because I'm not a Buddha, the Kensho experiences that I had though were deeply satisfying, though, it's hard to skein out the samadhi stuff from that than from the base consciousness. But the traditions say that the base consciousness is blissful, Satchit Ananda, awareness, bliss, consciousness. And it's like, so that's, I suppose you got that going for you, if you can, but nevertheless, it's like, it's the egoic view, it's according to the tradition and the experiences that I have, it's possible to transcend that. So it's like, insofar as nihilism is a view of reality, then you can have a different view, right? And I do think a lot of it, just as you're saying, that a lot of the problems and the suffering that's going on is coming from, not necessarily that society's forcing you to be nihilist, but there's a natural tendency towards it, and it's not being offset by, an opportunity to be to this. The spiritual has been basically written out, and even if you go to church, you're getting this sort of fundamentalism, right? Where they essentially have the atheistic materialist worldview of reality, and they just, again, but believe in God anyway. It's ridiculous to believe in God, but do it anyway because we tell you to do so. And that's hard for people to accept too. Like, for example, the whole idea, like, you make 51% evil, so then you go to hell for all eternity. And if you've been 51% good, then you go to heaven for all eternity. That doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, karma, I like karma because it's like, you just suffer whatever you caused. I mean, everything has a consequence, and it's exactly equal. What you just reap the benefit of all your good acts and all your bad acts continuously and through reincarnation, through your samsara, until you wake up. And at that point you cease, there's no more you though. That's what's funny about it. I was reading something the other day, like, you this, you that. I'm like, yeah, but at that stage there wouldn't be a you. And that's, having experienced that in the Kensho state, that's just a little bit of a taste, but that's very useful, to recognize it. Then again, that's perspective. But I think, like I said, that everything sucks, I'm going to die, all that. It's like, what? But there's definitely a lot of pain and suffering in reality, but there's also a lot of joy and beauty as well. And, you were talking about an experience you had that was negative. I mean, for example, I got fired from my first job, and I just remember that just was so devastating to me. And yet that launched me onto this whole other career that was much more, I hated that job. I couldn't stand it. I was being entombed, and being fired was awful, but it ended up being the best thing that happened to me. And it's sort of like, we just don't always know what the meaning of things are and what the purpose of it is and what the final outcome is from the experience. Even
Right.
just because
And
it's a painful
yes,
experience doesn't mean it's not a one that's worthwhile.
right. And one of the worst things about contemporary nihilism is that it can close you off from being open to things. Like I think really the bottom line for a lot of people, I mean, why do you think most people would be drawn to magic or and forms of mysticism or esoteric stuff, the occult? I think
Because they
people,
can't get what they want through conventional means.
that's definitely a huge reason. But beneath that, I think for a lot of people too is more they're maybe seeking an antidote to nihilism, right? So you want to say
There's a
something about
lot of
that?
ways of, yeah, well, that's what I'd say too, is like, the pain of meaninglessness is some of the worst,
Exactly.
that suffering that comes from that. So there's a lot of seekers, and we're in a period where with internet, all of a sudden you have an incredible selection and possibility of things that you can experience, and there's incredible amounts of stuff being translated. There's, teachers, like I was getting interested in this um, non-dualistic tantra, which
Hmm.
is from Kashmir in the Middle Ages.
Sure.
And
I
there's
know.
a guy, he's studied all this stuff academically, and then he's got a guru and everything, and he's putting these books out, and it's like,
Christopher
wow.
Wallace. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow. I mean, this very esoteric stuff that you wouldn't even have access to, that all of a sudden, boom, this is there. It's available. You know, and
Right.
so we
Yeah.
have it. It's like,
Abhinavagupta, he was the
yeah,
big
yeah, it's a
guy
spiritual
that.
smorgasbord. We have this buffet of like thousands of things you can choose from. And, people are really definitely, and again, that's part of the benefit of the nihilism, is because, if I'm in Iowa, right? 50 years ago, I could be a Lutheran or a Catholic or a Methodist or whatever. That would be my choices. You know what I mean? You'd have such a limited choice in terms of that. And now it's like you can do anything really. You've got this access to it, and so but you wouldn't have wanted to. I mean, until the pain got serious enough. It's like, why is there pain? It's like, well, without pain, people, I mean, I know the way I am. It's like, I don't just sit, you just stay with your, stay in the mud. You don't even move around. So I guess what I would say about it is that if you're looking at this and you're saying, well, you haven't proved anything, I know what this is nihilist is true. It's like, there's me, no, you can't prove it to me. And I'm like, that's true. I can't prove it to you. Essentially, all we're doing is saying, you know what? We're sort of saying, take a look at this. This is interesting stuff. We're kind of giving some possible suggestions. And there's going to be some people out there that say, you know what you're saying rings true for me. It resonates for me. Right. And I'm going to follow up on this. I find this to be useful, but
Definitely.
it's not a question of, you cannot prove worldview. I mean, if you're an atheistic materialist and an angel appears to you, it's a hallucination. It's an illusion. It's a hologram, because it's impossible for there to be an angel.
Right.
Therefore, it can't happen. And so whatever happens, you just eliminate. The facts are irrelevant when they contradict the worldview. Um,
Totally. Check this out. Here's kind of an instance of that, but in academia. So I knew someone who they were in a rather elite comparative religion graduate program at one point, and they wanted to study some form of mysticism. And the head of the department took this person aside, and they said to them basically, uh, mysticism is merely an invention and a convention, and you cannot possibly focus on mysticism here in this program, my boy. We can only focus on what can be known. That is the sociolinguistic, historical dimensions of things, and anything further. I mean, even to say that there's such a thing as religious or mystical experience is absurd. I mean, we all have experiences, and as Derrida and Deleuze have proven, these are just Herman, and basically saying this there's no such thing. Or if there is, we can't talk about it. So you can't study it here.
it's that's just, like I said, that's just classic. I mean, you got that sort of academia added on to it, because this academic view is that if you actually do something, then you're completely unobjective about it.
Right.
If you've actually play a musical instrument, then you can't. I mean, ethnomusicology is an exception to that, because then a lot of times they're participant observers. or sociology with a participant observer. And I enjoy reading that. I read a couple books. I read one by a guy who was a corrections officer in Sing Sing, and then another one by someone who was a sanitation worker in New York City. And they're both academics and wrote books about it.
Crazy.
So they had a really interesting perspective because they actually did it. They actually
Sure.
took the test, got hired, did the job. And at the same time, they were able to have simultaneously a subjective and objective view of it. When I think that's the best. I mean, to me, but see, the typical academic thing is like, okay, if you're doing it, then you can't talk about it.
And in this,
but then how can you understand it if you haven't done it?
Exactly. And in this case, also in there, in the argument was, we can't privilege this concept of experience over anything else. So we can't substantiate it or validate it or something in that way, because then we'd be invalidating all these other things. And of course we can't have that. Everything.
Well, this again is view that there's an objective reality out there, which we don't know.
Right.
I mean, if you think about it, everything you experience is in mind. It's like, okay, even the scientific mechanism is, okay, so the light comes into my eyes to the retinas. It's focused on the retina. It produces electrochemical impulses, right? Which go to the brain, right? Which are perceived in mind. So, the leaves out there, the sun is not in my head, right? It's like, it's all in mind. So it's like, there could be an objective reality, but you could never prove it. I mean, everything is your most direct experience is subjective, right? And whether or not that's produced by an objective reality, I mean, yes, no, maybe. I mean, like a dream, that's right there. I mean, it's funny because I had watched this movie last night, and then I dreamt a little bit of it, the characters into it. And it's like, at the time, it was a fully realized reality, right? But there was no objective sense perceptions that it was related to. The mind created it all by itself. So it's like, that has to cast some doubt about objective reality. And so, that experience, so that's what I was talking about with nihilism and his experience. It's not an invalid experience. There's no question that nihilism, there's some insights that are useful.
Yes.
There, right? That they're seeing things, because if you have a Pollyanna approach, which a lot of people do,
right,
it's like, or just a blind approach, like, oh, I'm gonna die. Oh, so what? It doesn't matter. If you don't take your imminent death seriously, and you don't take the ephemerality of things seriously, then you're missing a big chunk of reality. If you deny pain, if you deny suffering, it's funny. I go to the cemetery. And it's so weird because people, it's like happy talk. Like people put up like people on their tombstones will put like the Iowa Hawkeye emblem. I'm like, what? I mean, that seems really weird to me. Or people are like leaving like these little spinner things. It's all this like happy stuff, whereas the older Victorian thing was like mourning. You go into mourning, you wear black, you know what I mean? And you have all this, skulls and stuff, or like the Middle Ages. It's a really weird, like, it's like a happiness, like I want to have a funeral where everyone's happy, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, death is not happy. It's like, they just sort of like refusal to acknowledge the reality there. The problem with the nihilism is that it's a limited perspective, and it's an inaccurate perspective. And it's a perspective that breeds a lot of pain and suffering and goes along with a certain amount of selfishness.
Definitely.
Because you're not seeing yourself as being bigger, a part of a bigger thing. It's just you. I mean, yeah, like if a skin cell dies, I mean, you're not going to think of that as a disaster. It's just a natural part of life. But the skin cell, like, oh, fuck, I'm gone, I'm dying. You know what I mean? So it's like, if your perspective is bigger than yourself, then the death of the body isn't necessarily a disaster. Or if you accept change as inevitable, as opposed to being threatening, right? And go with the flow, then again, that's so nihilism, like I said, it's pervasive in society. It's unconscious, right? And it has a, insofar as it's unconscious and it's taken as being accurate view of all reality, that's where the problem comes in. Because like I said, it's not wrong. It's just a limited perspective without recognizing it's a limited perspective.
Right. Okay. So how would you say that a worldview that encompasses things like the practice of magic, practice of astrology, how can that serve as sort of an alternate path out of nihilism for people who are new, to these things, maybe?
The first thing would be to work at something seriously. Take a particular practice, a magical practice or spiritual practice or whatever, and try to get serious about it. I mean, don't just read about it. And I've been reading some books. It's like, well, that's not going to get you very far. I tried it for a week and it didn't work, so I'm off to something else. You need to find something congenial, I think, that resonates with you, and then do a deep dive into it. But if, for example, like horary astrology is you ask a question of an astrologer and they take the chart of the question, right? Not your birth chart, but the chart of the question. And
Meaning the chart of when a
you
person asks the question.
Ask the question, you receive and understand it is what I use.
Yes.
And so that has the answer. And I've done for clients probably coming up on 5,000 of these charts in my professional career. And what's amazing about it is not every time, I mean, it's not 100% accurate, but it's incredible how that chart of the question gives you the answer to the question.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything fits together. It's not meaningless. It's not, random. In fact, everything's incredibly patterned. And again, horary, you could look at a birth chart and say, oh, there's rays or beams from the planets at that angle or something. But horary, the time of the asking the question, there's no possible energetic or material causality that could do that. In fact, it's impossible, according to an atheistic materialist, because everything's random. But it's not. Everything is so patterned, right? Now, the Renaissance view would be that the planets control your emotional state. And so when you ask a question that's very important to you emotionally, you're in tune with the planetary cycles, right?
Mm.
And so those heavenly cycles then reflect these underlying spiritual cycles, right? And that's what you're seeing in the charts. You're seeing through the chart underlying spiritual cycles. So insofar as the material world conforms to those spiritual cycles, which it more or less does, then you're able to and use your intuition and judgment as well. And that's your personal connection. So if you do a horary and you get it right, you're like, that's interesting. Do 10 of them and get them right. You're like, you know what? Someone's saying that things are random and there's no spiritual connection. Things doesn't know what they're talking about, because I just did these 10 horaries and they came out correctly.
Right.
So there's all sorts of experiences you can have.
Personal experience. Yeah, that's what I was kind of.
That break that paradigm.
Right.
Because if it works, if it works at all, it shouldn't work. If everything's random and meaningless, then it wouldn't work. If it works, then there's patterning, right? And there's spiritual causality is actually taking place. And so that's one of the first things I think it's very useful about just the actual practical, following a spiritual path or using magic is like, it's revolutionary, really, if you think about it. Because a lot of times what people do is they'll compartmentalize, right? And they go to work as a, computer programmer and they go home and do magic, and it's like completely separate, right? And that's there's a King Crimson 20th century schizoid man.
21st, yeah.
21st century schizoid
classic,
man.
yeah.
And it's like, that's what we are. We're schizoid. We're split, right? And if you think about it, you're like, wait a second, this magic works, then that means this atheistic materialism is not
it's not
very
accurate.
Good model. It's not a good model. That isn't to say that another model is reality. That's a mistake too. But if you're looking at a map and your map is really inaccurate, you might want to get yourself a more accurate map, right? And if your map says that this is not the road to Des Moines, but you're driving down the road and you can see the Des Moines there, it's like, wait a second, this is not going to work as a map.
Sure.
Right. And that's what I would say about the atheistic materialism, is that to be an atheistic materialist, you have to go around with, your eyes shut half the time and ignore tons of things that are happening in order to kind of piece that together. It's just not a very effective, which again, in fundamentalism is another type of atheistic materialism. I mean, you're essentially wiping out the entire modern thought, whether you're evangelical or you're a scientist, because they're all atheistic materialists.
So we have individual experience of whether it's via ritual divination or magic, which, we need to have a talk maybe and just focus on magic at some point and get more into what we mean and stuff like that, but not right now. But what I was just thinking of as you were speaking was, so again, which is kind of what I wanted you to kind of say, we have individual experience as a potential path that's a really powerful one, because it's like you said, if people can experience for themselves that, like you said, they say, oh, there's no Des Moines here, but yet there it is. It breaks that spell, right, of the that had previously existed. Years ago, in sort of the occult world, at one point I began to see, the term gnosis was bandied about or, attached to everything. And without really going into what we mean by gnosis, but I think at the very least we could say, well, it has something to do with an inner transcendent experience, right?
Gnosis is as a
knowledge of an
is
inner knowing.
not a conceptual knowledge. It's
Right.
not informational.
Right.
There's an Islamic term. I'll pronounce it incorrectly. It's Arabic.
Sure.
I think it's dwak, something like along those lines, which means tasting, right?
Tasting.
Which is it's like I said, you can have a whole thing about, oh, this wine, I've read all about it. I read it in the newspaper. I read this book about it. Someone told me about it, blah, blah, blah. It's like, what does it taste like? And then you have the experience of actually tasting it. So it's like love, right?
Right.
I mean, I remember as a kid, I'm like, ooh, it sounded kind of gross. The whole, it's like sex or love, all that stuff, just didn't get it. And then when you fall in love, you're like, oh. And that's a good example because, yes, that's an individual experience, right?
Right.
But it's certainly not unique to you.
No.
And that's what I would say about the spiritual stuff too, is it's not as if you're inventing this stuff.
Exactly.
There's a collective experience that's valid as well as the individual
really
experience.
Yeah. That's kind of what I wanted to get to. What you were making me think of was, I was, as you were speaking, I was just recalling, accounts of collective experiences. For instance, let's say, in one of ancient Greeks, of different mysteries, where these collective mystical rituals were held for days at a time. And I don't know how many people were involved. I don't know if we can ever really know that, but certainly it was just more than, one person. A lot of people were undergoing these things together, and there were all kinds of course, groups with their own rites.
I mean, we have that now.
Paths. We have it now, yes, but
in a little bit of a degenerate form. I mean,
that's my point. Yes,
two that are easily accessible, though. One is super easily accessible. For example, is the mass. Like I used to go to communion at this Lutheran church near my house, and it's so funny because every time I took communion, I would get high. I had a definite, really elevated state. It was like a high from it. And this is like a Lutheran church, it's 2,000 years old, right? And it's kind of worn down, modern, they're atheistic materialists to a certain extent, but the participation in that ritual still had power. Another one that's interesting is the Masons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you take the degrees, you participate in these ritual performances, right? And Zoller, my teacher, one of the things that you had me do to sort of prepare sort of philosophically, so to speak, or the foundation stuff that we're doing today, was to become a Mason. And so I took the degrees, and that's sort of worn down because the brothers don't really get it. They're just kind of doing it, but there is an incredible power in going through and physically participating in the stuff. That's got, and the collective quality of it is important as well. Now it'd really be trippy to do Masonic ritual with Masons that were tripping on it and really understood it. But nevertheless, even doing it the degrees myself in the sort of degenerate form was worthwhile.
Well, check this out. Let me just throw this out there too, because I think it's more fun to consider it. But so years ago, when I first had moved to Seattle, I don't know if you've heard, there was a big record label called Subpop that became extremely popular for a very long time and still around. And long ago, when I was involved with rock music and stuff, playing it, I had read an interview with one of the owners of the label, and surely he wasn't the first to say this, but the way he put this I thought was quite good. And he said, I don't remember the question that was posed to him, but he said his reply to whatever it was something like, well, going to the clubs and seeing a really great band is the closest thing we have today. Most of us have today to going to church, to a religious experience where we're experiencing this, this power that at best can be a kind of transcendent thing together, and stuff. So and again, I'm sure that was that something similar to that had been formulated by some rock critic or whatever, like long before then or whatever. But
I've always thought it would be really cool to have, I don't know, do you know the band, they don't, not in existence anymore, Dead Can Dance?
Sure, I love
Yeah.
them.
I
Yeah,
would have liked to, it'd be cool to have somebody like, oh, that's the kind of music I like, because other people like different things, but it'd be interesting with them because they're very thoughtful about what they do.
yes.
If they did astrological music, and so if they did like a Mercury concert and it was elected as a Mercury time,
Oh wow,
and then you
totally.
had like Mercury music, and then you had all sorts of stage stuff and participation and everything like that. It's like that would be, or like for example, you know, I just think about talismanic, like if you had a talisman to protect the city. And so we decided to consecrate it and have a big procession through the city and a feasting afterwards and
It's
stuff like
fantastic.
that. But
Totally.
that's
Hmm.
not possible now
No,
as yet. Now you could do the concert, right? But that collective, because we're atheistic materialists, and also people fight about it. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the spiritual practices I do is I have a sort of a Japanese or Eastern approach, which is that I just meld everything, because I'm simultaneously Buddhist, Sufi, Christian, whatever, all at the same time. And it's like, oh, I've got to convert. I've got to change from one, this, the Abrahamic religions. It's like, you can only be one, right? And if you're not didn't grow up in it, it's a little suspect. I mean, you can convert, but it's kind of like, it's not really that acceptable. You're always kind of a second class citizen, you know, and so that makes it harder to, you know what I mean, because everyone's kind of at each other's throat too. That's another thing too, is like there's
sure.
a sort of like competition, you know.
And all of these things contribute to nihilism too, because people like
Yeah.
look at these horrible religions and none of them has a monopoly and they act like they do. So fuck them. It's all garbage,
The
destroy
thing
it.
about a religion though is it's like, since the aspiration is so high, right? It immediately, you know, it casts the brighter the light, the darker the shadow.
Yeah,
And also anything positive, it becomes a target for, manipulative, power hungry,
definitely.
demons and people and spiritual forces and negative people and, all that kind of stuff too. It's like it gets manipulated and used for, I mean, the Catholic Church is a good example of
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
It's
Sure.
like
Sure.
horrible stuff, and pedophiles and all this kind of stuff, and
Right.
it's all covered up and the power and all that. So of course people get, oh, because they think the problem is they're not able to separate the 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 vessel from the from the liquid, so to speak. You know what I mean? It's like the wine glass from the wine. It's like if you don't have a wine glass, like if you don't have the structure of the of the church in the sense of having a building and dogma, and you've got functionaries and all that, there's no one to pass it on. I mean, Jesus would do his thing and that would be the end of it,
Right.
you
Hmm.
know?
Yeah.
And so but once you have the functionaries, then you get that, I was just reading this thing from this is from the Gospel of Thomas. It says the scribes and Pharisees have taken the keys of knowledge and hidden them, right? Um, but you be ye wise as serpent and gentle as doves, which I like a lot. I like that too, is because a lot of the modern spirituality is like you like a doormat, like you
Yeah.
just get walked all over, just
Right.
like let everyone abuse the shit out of you. That's what you're supposed to do. And it's like, no, I'm not really a believer in that.
No,
Um,
definitely.
but
Definitely not.
it's wise as serpents, and gentle as doves. That's a good combination.
And we could use a lot more of that. I mean, I had wanted to say something earlier about kind of nihilistic madness that seems to be breaking out with the breakdown of society, American society that's been accelerating for a bunch of years, but I can't really think of anything that interesting to say about it
Well,
except it's
it's one of
happening.
those things that's sort of like, you know, it's just you think of like immigrants that come to the United States or any place, the first generation immigrants, they've come up really terrible circumstances, right? And there's a lot of hope, and so they come and they work really hard, and they build up something for their kids, and then their kids are just like, this is just a stereotype, right? Kids have like had it easy, It's the same thing with like the person who creates this huge business empire, right?
Right.
And their kids just lazy. I mean, they didn't have anything. I mean, so American society has had it easy. For a lot of people just have, there's definitely poor people and oppressed people and all that. But the middle class stuff, a lot of times people have really easy lives, relatively speaking. And so, plus there's no enemy anymore. So you have to have an enemy. So you just turn on each other, plus the American thing is done. It's like played itself out,
Right. That would be
and
a good
that's
subject.
the Chinese are the next probably. I mean, they're on the upswing, and it's just one of those things. It's like these are just cycles, and you can just see where if you can see what happened in the past, you can sort of see the cycle. Now, I sort of feel like we're in a Weimar Germany kind of level. There's a lot of this like view of like not there's because that Weimar Republic, big chunks of society felt it was illegitimate. I mean, the conservatives and the right wing and the left, the extreme left too, all were against it. And I feel like we're sort of in that state now with the government. It's like,
we're in a
I
very
don't want to get into
unhappy
politics
cycle.
at all.
No.
But nevertheless, it's like this is just sort of the cycles that are going on. And if you stand back from it, you're like, okay, that's where we are in the cycle. Is it spring, winter, fall, summer? Where are we?
Right. See, that's this is again, and I think that would be a great topic to speak on at another time, just the cycles of civilizations and such, because there's so much great stuff has been written and done about that. But for the moment, I mean, again, that's really my motivation for even doing a lot of this stuff and this kind of work. It's almost like, man, I just feel so acutely the misery of this cycle. And I know many people I know do. And so I just would hope that maybe, even if it's just a few words or, talks here or there or whatever, or via whatever means, to put stuff out there to people to show them that there are other possibilities and to at least know that this stuff exists.
Yeah, I think that's what
try it. Just pick
that's
it
what
up.
I would say with this is that I don't think you can come away from listening to us and saying that we haven't thought about it, right? Yeah. I mean, we've thought about this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff. Now you can reject it because it doesn't accord with your views, right?
Right.
But, if you think about this stuff, you're like, that's an interesting perspective, right? And then the question is, does it resonate? Because if you're feeling like this is all there is, right? That all there is meaningless and hopelessness and pain and all that sort of stuff, it's terrible. It's like, okay, there is another way to see reality, right? It doesn't get rid of the pain, right? But it doesn't, it's not necessarily the only thing that there is, and that's what I would say. So, and I think, again, astrology, this is kind of getting far afield from technical discussion of astrology and magic, but nevertheless, as you pointed out, astrology and magic are very useful as a sort of a signpost and as an escape hatch. And ultimately, astrology and magic are not directly means to enlightenment, right? And that's one of the things that I've been working with and realizing is that, even with my devotional practice, it doesn't directly lead to enlightenment, but nevertheless, it's very useful in a lot of ways in a spiritual realm. I mean, certainly these are practical applications of spirituality. And if that's true, then it's not, atheistic materialism is not, as we say, not the complete view of reality.
Not the best game in town.
It's not yeah. And so, but the question is, what are you pulled to? And so if you feel a resonance to this, then you can say, you can take heart and say, you know what? Just as Andy said, there's other ways to be. I don't have to be freaked out. I don't have to buy into this dominant paradigm. I've never been happy with that dominant paradigm. And now, you know what? I don't have to go with that. And so I think that that's, again, it's not for everybody, but there are going to be people like myself that, I got some very useful, that was very useful in my spiritual progress to be able to have the astrology and magic work. And that was very helpful to me. And so that was a good stepping stone into other, more directly spiritual methods that I got into.
Right. And I would like to add to that, as one gets into this stuff, I think it can really follow and help if you get into really understanding metaphysical and magical models and draw upon them and stuff. But I think just, like skillful means, right? They use that in Buddhism as far as using different approaches for different people, you know, to teach. I mean, I had a friend, you know, once long ago, and we had to talk about magic and spirits and such. And she didn't really have direct experience of a lot of these kinds of things. And I said to her, well, can you kind of get your head around, or maybe at least entertain the notion that there are people who are not insane, and they maybe have techniques and have had experiences that, for all intents and purposes, are of them interacting with personalities that seem quite autonomous to themselves, and that there may be results from these interactions. I mean, can you accept that this maybe is true, that there are people who've had these experiences and these people are not lunatics? And she just kind of looked at me for a few seconds and was like, yeah, Andy, I can accept that, but you know, but surely it's just parts of their psyche that are talking to them, or they're interacting with other parts of their psyche. And I was like, okay. You know, I had no desire to argue with her about it, but it's like, maybe that's true, maybe it's not true, but that's how she needed to. That's the narrative.
See, what I would say is
you
we're
know?
just kind of throwing it out there. It's like a little magic trick, and if you like the trick, cool, go with it. If you don't
Go
like
with-
it, that's fine too. I mean, it's sort of
okay.
like, because it's, you know, when people come to me, they're like, can you prove astrology? I'm like, I don't want to bother with that. I mean,
Can
when
you
you're ready
prove
to
it?
learn,
Right.
then I'm here,
Yeah.
right? And you have to figure it out on your own whether or not you can the worldview and whether you can accept it or not. And it's like, it's completely pointless to try to prove or do any of this sort of stuff. And it's also
Sure.
completely pointless. I've had people email and say, why should I study astrology? I'm like, that's up to you to decide. Once
Really?
you've
People have
decided, yeah,
actually emailed you that?
yeah, sure.
Why
Well,
should
that's
I
my
study?
job. I'm the answer man. You know, it's like, and I should convince them. I mean, I'm a salesman, right? I should be selling this more. It's
I
like, you know,
see.
what am I going to get out of this? You know, tell me why. Look, that's up to you to decide. It's like, if you think this is worthwhile, there's a lot of work, you know, to take the full course is a lot of work, and it takes a lot of dedication and everything. And because it's a serious study, you know, and it's funny because people email me like, how fast can I get through this? And I'm like, that is the wrong question. You don't want to
Oh
even, if that's what you're
God.
concerned about, then you shouldn't even be bothering with this, because it's like, it's going to take a while,
Look, I
you
heard this. I
know?
heard you wrote this book. It's pretty good. How long is that? Much time is that going to take me to get through your book?
I got jammed through. Well, I got to eat it fast and get on to the next thing. I got to devour it and on to the next thing. But that's, again,
Yeah.
that sort of egoic, which is fine. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's like, I'm not, that's not where I'm coming from. So, you know, but I do like the idea of, you know, if you've had a sense, if you've been depressed by nihilism, or you're depressed by atheistic materialism and maybe didn't even know why, right? And you're a thinking person. You're like, you know, I don't want to just accept this magical stuff without some logical basis. Now, it's
Mhm.
internally consistent. If you accept the spiritual exists, then it all makes sense. But you have to make that leap. But once you do it, or if you're open to that, then wow, there's all this stuff out there if you're interested in it. So that's what I would say, is that really looking at this, if this appeals to you, if it resonates with you, great. If it doesn't, that's great too, you know? And there's no, you can't really look at this and say it's right or wrong. It's a question of whether it's resonant or non-resonant with you. If it's resonant, then hey, this may be something you want to take a look at and follow up on, and do something and work with. So that's essentially why we did it, because I think we really felt like we needed, even though, you know, like I said, this podcast is astrology and magic as a spiritual, you know, path. We really did realize that we needed to go deep with this, that we needed to get to the deep foundational level, and that people were sort of not being able to understand what we were talking about in some ways because of the lack of understanding of the worldview and atheistic materialism and nihilism. So I think
Right.
this is worthwhile and useful, and I think this is probably a good point to
Okay.
end this.
Okay. I
And
think
we'll,
maybe in another talk we can go on to some further thoughts about nihilism, because I just got a bunch, but it's not for now.
yeah, I think
All right.
this is a good point.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds
Thank you,
good, man.
Andrew.
Thank you.